From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. Take a second to think about the essentials inside your home. Your fridge, your freezer, your air conditioning unit. Do you know where it comes from? Do you know who makes them? A joint investigation between the Toronto Star and the Guelph Mercury Tribune found hundreds of shipments to some of Canada's biggest retail brands that stem from Chinese manufacturers accused of human rights violations. Many of those shipments can be traced to a region in China, where observers, the United States, and Canada's parliamentary subcommittee say a genocide is being committed against Uyghur Muslims. We're talking to the reporters of that investigation, Graeme Nuttall, investigative reporter for the Toronto Star based in Vancouver, and Graeme McNaughton, reporter for the Guelph Mercury Tribune. We dive into the reporting, tracking how a supply chain fueled by forced labor may be finding its way to you. Jeremy, Graeme, thanks for making the time to talk about your reporting.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Let's start with some important context of the Xinjiang area in China and what is happening to the Uyghur population. Jeremy, I'll turn to you first. Can you explain what is happening in that region of China?
Yeah, well, Xinjiang is an autonomous region, and it's inhabited mainly by an ethnic group of people known as Uyghurs. And they're a Turkic group, they're Muslims. They sort of look like people that are more from Central Asia than East Asia. So there's also there's an ethnic diversity to it. And what's been going on for the last few years, according to credible accounts, is about 2 million of them have been placed in internment camps, depending on who you talk to. Some say 1 million, some say 2. I'm saying 2 because that's what was testified on Parliament Hill.
But now an inside look in the Chinese government's own words. A leaked 9-page memo reads like a how-to manual, telling officials to strictly implement measures to prevent escape. That means 24/7 video surveillance, watchtowers, and double-locked doors.
About 2 million of them in internment camps. These camps are aimed at basically assimilating them to more of a Chinese and East Han culture, which is the dominant ethnic group in China. And so they've basically tried to push out their religion, the language. They have them sit through Chinese Communist Party indoctrination videos. And what's been also coming out is concern that a lot of them are being used for forced labor in some of these camps or shipped to other areas of China where they are also, being put in factories and forced to make products for export or domestic consumption. As I said, there's credible reports that this is going on. Chinese government has insisted that these are just vocational training facilities. But what we have from groups like the Australian Strategic Policy Institute is real concerns that this is going on with some cases of eyewitness testimony.
Right. And the U.S. and Canada's parliamentary subcommittee, they've termed it as a genocide.
Yes, the last day of the Trump administration, they declared it as a genocide, what's happening in Xinjiang, because there's also accusations of forced sterilization and other abuse. And Canada had a parliamentary subcommittee on international human rights declare that it is consistent with the Genocide Convention back in October.
And in terms of this investigation, it's a joint investigation between the Toronto Star and the Guelph Mercury Tribune. Graeme, I'll turn to you. What made up your reporting? What kinds of documents did you guys look into for this story?
Well, I guess sort of the big one that really came in are bills of lading, which are essentially receipts for shipments when they go from one country to another. Going through customs, you got to show where it's coming from, just so you don't have stuff flowing in and out with no idea where it's coming from. And looking at that and then finding out some of these factories that have been specifically cited as forced labor having been alleged to have taken place there, it turned to, okay, we know who these factories are. Who are they supplying? And it's through those bills of lading we can see stuff as it leaves the factory. And then, all right, where does it go from there? And it's going all over the world. And that was probably the biggest thing. Once that was figured out, how to track those down, you find out who's buying it.
What kinds of items are being imported into Canada and other countries that's being made in Xinjiang?
Well, the ones that we tracked in ours, we don't have any of the ones that were made in Xinjiang, but it was factories in other parts of China where it has been alleged that Uyghur people have been forced to relocate to work in these factories. And as far as the type of goods, unsurprisingly, textiles, so clothing is definitely a big one. The other one is going into home appliances. We're looking at fridges, freezers, air conditioners. So, stuff that's in every home. It's kind of hard when, with clothing, there's lots of clothing options, but with a fridge, everyone's got a fridge and it's in your home. If it's coming from places like this, made by people who are being forced to work there.
And what Canadian companies did you find in your reporting, in these shipping logs in your investigation?
So as far as Canadian companies, when we're looking at home appliances, the Brick is definitely one that stands out. We also have companies like Danby, which supplies goods to stores all over the place, including Costco, where we found what it was that on the bill of lading, it said that it was going from Danby to Costco, but the shipping address for Danby was the same as one of those sanctioned factories in China.
Right. So Danby is receiving it and then providing it to companies like Costco.
As far as we can tell, it looks like actually it was shipping directly from the factory to Costco, but it was just sort of taking of that middle step between factory to supplier to outlet. It was just, skipping that middle step.
If I'm getting this right, then some Canadian companies, like Graeme just cited, like the Brick, some of these Canadian companies, some of the biggest brands in the country, they are getting their products from forced labor camps in what has been termed as a genocide. In turn, we, the consumers, are buying these products.
Yeah, it is important to also note that these are accused forced labor camps, not necessarily something the Chinese government has taken responsibility for yet. And a lot of the evidence, though credible, is still a bit scattered. But yeah, that is basically what's been going on. And as we reported in the piece, the amount that we saw is only a small fraction of what is likely coming into Canada, because Graeme, who, by the way, did all the data searching for this, an amazing job. What Graeme found was that these are just the items that are coming through the US to Canada. So the actual data that we got from the US isn't even available in Canada. The stuff that's coming directly from China into Canada is likely far greater. So this is really tip of the iceberg.
So we don't have a true understanding of the real number of shipping, is what you're saying?
Nope. I don't even know if you could guesstimate, because as I said, all the data is not even public. So it's hard to know what's going on.
In terms of the pure numbers, how many shipping containers are we talking about here? Like, what's the sheer amount?
Well, what Graeme found through the US was, I believe, 800 since 2018. If I drive 15 minutes from my place here in Burnaby down to the port of Vancouver, I'll probably see far more than 800 shipping containers just sitting in the port.
Yeah, because some of these ships, they're carrying thousands of these things as they come in, and we just found a few hundred.
And it's due to transparency, or a lack of transparency, I should say, in Canadian shipping logs, that you're only able to access this information because it's coming through the US, which does provide this data.
The United States government provides it, and the software that we used just basically harvests it from open US government data and puts it into a readable format for you. And because you can't even access it in Canada, we don't know.
We'll be right back. Your reporting has also found not just retail companies like Costco and the Brick in these shipping logs. Bombardier, the transit manufacturer, that name also comes up. Can you explain their connection here?
Bombardier, they've said that they were buying parts off of one company called KTK Group, which is also being used by a lot of other companies. And KTK Group first was accused of using forced labor by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute back in March. And when that happened, Bombardier set out to do an investigation into the allegations to determine if there's any truth to it, wanting to obviously take action if there was. They've said that they found no evidence in their investigation that the allegations made by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute hold water. And again, KTK it's also used by a number of other companies in Canada, including parts from KTK were put on Ottawa transit vehicles through a third-party contractor. So it's a large problem that apparently a lot of companies are using KTK. As I said, I mean, Bombardier, as well as other companies we've spoken to, have said they also did investigations that found no evidence with KTK. But ASPE, as well as the US government, still maintain that they believe that that's what's happening.
So these companies, when you've spoken to them or other think tanks have asked them about this, advocacy groups, they've responded and said in their internal audits, there's no evidence of forced labor. Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Graeme, how reliable are these internal audits too?
That's a great question. The one guy that I spoke to, Dr. Crane from the University of Bath in the UK, and we talked about this, about how a lot of these audits that companies are doing, you're not getting a real sense of what is going on. It's a, one day in and out, and you can easily prepare for those rather than, he was saying, these audits should be a few days long, unannounced, be able to take workers outside of the factories so that you can interview them not under the eyes of their boss. That way you can probably get a better sense of, what is actually going on. And the other thing he said is that with how forced labor works is that a lot of these workers would get moved around. They're not there permanently. They could be there for, they get a surge order and they need to fill it and they need more people in. So these people get brought in to help fill it. And then once that order's done, they're gone.
We're not talking about a company where there's a stringent HR policy where they keep track of all the people working there. The workplace and the work environment is an uncertain one.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Canadian government's announcement a couple of weeks ago now, I believe they even said that, you shouldn't be relying solely on these third-party audits as your basis as to whether there is or is not forced labor in these factories.
We live in an age of corporate responsibility, right? Where many consumers want to know that what they're buying is ethically made, is sustainably sourced. Companies, if they're doing ethical business, they often use this as a selling point. This reporting runs counter to that sense of corporate responsibility. In the observers that you talk to, the professors, what do they say is the responsibilities that companies have in making sure that we're not buying products from forced labor camps?
I didn't talk to academics for that, but I did speak to people in the United States who are behind legislation to outright ban products from the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. It's a bill called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and it was brought into the U.S. Congress last year, I believe, and it didn't get through the Senate before the government dissolved. So it's going to be reintroduced again, but it essentially would put the onus on corporations and companies, to prove that anything they want to bring that was made in Xinjiang into the United States, to prove it wasn't made with forced labor, rather than the government having to prove that it is and preventing it from being let into the country. That, of course, is the one problem there, is that doesn't, a lot of this is going on throughout China, not just in Xinjiang. So that's one problem, but it is a stepping stone at least. As you said, I think Graeme spoke to academics about that.
Right, Graeme?
Yeah, Dr. Crane that I spoke to, he had said that, businesses are definitely responsible for having to root this out of their supply chains. Companies should be more transparent about where their products are coming from. I know there are some companies, the ones that come top of mind are the Bay and H&M, where if you go on their website, you can see who their suppliers are. They're like, here's the factories that we supply with. And while I do feel that, it should be on the company to be more responsible and show that there is no forced labor, that extra level of transparency, you are saying like, here's where we get our stuff from. If you want to look into this company, here's all the information that's available for you to look into. When you think about it, like, some of these companies where it's like, I would have no idea where their stuff is coming from. And a lot of people don't either. They're looking for what's the best bang for my buck.
Yeah. What's the latest fashion? What's cheapest? That's what a lot of consumers are looking for.
Yeah.
As Jeremy mentioned there, at least in the US, potentially if the legislation is passed, that the burden of proof is on the companies to prove their supply chain. What kind of responsibility does the federal government have in holding Canadian companies to account in these cases?
Well, right now, it's pretty much just weak promises, I guess you could say. The recent measures that came in the other day, for instance, to have companies having to sign an integrity declaration, there's no actual real, consequences, except for I believe they don't get access to trade consulars if they can't do this. There's nothing that says you still can't bring it in. It seems like just a lot of hand-wringing, and that's about it. There's another piece of legislation in the Canadian Senate called the Modern Slavery Act, which aims to prevent forced labor from coming into Canada too. But it's important to note that this was introduced in the Senate because it already failed when it was introduced in the House as a private member's bill by John McKay back in 2018. So you do have to wonder how serious the Canadian government is about preventing this stuff from getting in the country.
Right, that so far at least, there seems to be a lack of maybe political will around this?
I think that, it's a lack of political will because of already rocky relations with China. But I also think that Canadians are quite often have a better impression of their own morality as a country than the actual reality of it is. And I think that's part of it as well. And not having this data that we used public, the Canadian data public, allows them to continue to believe what they want to believe about themselves. And this is why forced transparency is important.
It's a bit of a mirror, perhaps, that we're being forced to think about, to reflect on.
Yes.
Yeah, it's one thing to say, yeah, we don't bring in any products that were made by forced labor. But if we don't know who you're getting your products from, how do we know that for sure?
So that's the part that I'm thinking about too, that somebody is listening to this and has read your report and thinks, well, what can I do about it? Right? How do I, as a person, affect change? Is it by learning where the supply chains are, learning where the source of their items are coming from? Is it voting with dollars? What can somebody listening take from this?
If I were somebody listening, I would want to write my MP and ask about the data becoming public so that we can figure out exactly what's going on and how big of a problem this is. And then after that, after we know the data, then we as a people, as a country, can decide where to go from there.
Graeme?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to, as you said, vote with your dollar if you don't know what you're voting for. Greater transparency from the government as far as shipping data would be essential, because then we could get a really good idea of this is what the situation is, what needs to be changed, what needs to be fixed.
Right. It's hard to go about fixing a problem if you don't understand the scope of the problem.
Exactly.
Jeremy, Graeme, thank you for your time and for all of your reporting on this.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.
That is Jeremy Nuttall of the Toronto Star and Graeme McNaughton of the Guelph Mercury Tribune. Since the publication of this investigation, Bombardier released a statement saying that it does not anticipate further shipments from KTK Group in the near future. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.